Hey there, it's me Olivia. Welcome to my channel. Today we are going to share a story called The Hidden Heir's Shocking Transformation by Brandy. For more interesting and exclusive stories, please subscribe to my channel and visit my Patreon page for early access, link in the description. The purpose of a small loop in the end of the rod became apparent as Mother drew a final part of the diabolical device from the chest that had held the garment. A small lock, jeweled and intricate to rival the most precise of timepieces, bound the loop in the wire to a corresponding loop in the back of the garment. "What key opens that lock?" my maiden's voice gasped. "You will not know that now or ever," she replied. Something in her tone let me know that she had once asked the same question and received the same reply. I turned to look at her in surprise, but my own protest was stifled by the view displayed in a tall mirror behind her shoulder. Whatever else that device might accomplish, it had transformed me into a woman in body. It appeared Mother, as a maiden, had been a most shapely lass. Now, whether I wanted it or not, that shape defined me as well. My long golden hair did much to complete the picture. It reminded me of my earlier comment. "Well, Mother, it is certain that no one will penetrate my disguise now." I tried to chuckle for her sake, but the device left me too little breath for more than a whispered comment. "Yes, dear, that was my concern when you mentioned it earlier. The only justification for this garment is that it has that virtue, even when the maiden may not." She continued, "Now, let us get you dressed. It is impossible for a princess to dress herself, and it would be too suspicious if I took care of everything for you with my own hands. Once you are dressed in your lover, others can aid you. However, only I will ever release you from your protection. That has been our way for generations and will be our justification now." She summoned servants and opened her own dressers to find the proper gown for me. While she considered choices that I would eventually have to make on my own, others attended to my hair. A woman's rank was displayed in the combs and pins she wore in her hair any time she was out of her own chambers. Those of a princess were many and varied, and it was clear that Mother was again correct. No woman could place them all properly by herself. By the time they were done, a gown had been selected, along with stockings and shoes. It was clear that this was again a chore that would need assistance, for while wearing the maiden's lover, I could not bend sufficiently to place stockings on myself, nor shoes. The final assistant was a cosmetician skilled in arts imported from far-off Araby and even further lands to the east, more legend than real yet none the less artistic. He transformed my face so that all remaining vestiges of Deacon were removed and only Charisse remained. In the hustle and bustle of so many attendants, I had not had time to look again into the mirror. As though at a signal, all drew back and an aisle was made for me to the looking-glass. If I had still possessed the breath to do so, I would have gasped. As it was, I grew lightheaded with shock and had to be steadied by several pairs of hands. Like all court gowns, my dress was ornate, yet the decoration in this gown complemented the shape displayed, not distracting from the flow of waist and swell of bosom. Only the full, wide skirt departed from the curves beneath, providing security against a too intimate revelation of a lady's limbs. Mother had selected a gown of a deep, rich blue, highlighted with gold. The combination picked up the colors of my hair and eyes, colors which Mother displayed as well. "That was the gown I wore the day I met your father," she explained, the bright shine back in her eyes. A dismissive wave of her hand sent the servants scurrying, all but one she called by name. "Amy, send to Bertha's chambers and see if it would be convenient for him to receive us at this time." The woman was gone in an instant, returning in barely more time with his reported assent. "Mother," I whispered, "why not have him come here?" "We need to maintain the fiction of his reign until at least the dawn," she explained. "Besides, it will do you good to get out and about." Taking my hand in her own, she led me down the corridor to Bertha's apartments. At the rap of his guard, his door opened. He stood there himself, but did not move back into the room to allow us to enter. Charisse?" he stammered. "Yes, brother, it is your sister," I replied. My voice, still strange to him though I was becoming accustomed to it, caused him to start out of his stupor and finally move back into the room. I would never have believed it. Even after the transformation Mother called us down to see, I would never had credited any report of this miracle, he chattered. You are not merely feminine, you are beautiful. Thank you. Mother's imprinted mannerisms brought out the demure response without conscious thought. Beritha's eyes had lit up with pleasure at the sight of the pretty maiden that I had become. It overshadowed, for a moment, his own fate. Still, it was clear that this had been weighing heavily on his mind, for it sobered quickly. "Can you do this, Deacon?" he asked. "Yes, my brother. I can. I will, for our realm, for our people, and for you." As I said it, I felt an echo of the white cold mind in my voice and saw conviction greater than my own appear on Beritha's features. And peace. His honor was such that his own sacrifice was not an unrealistic price for him to pay, but it gave him peace to know it would not be in vain. Would I be able to keep the promise I had just made? I wished my own mind were as certain as I had caused his to be. The dawn found Mother and I watching from the battlements as the 4 known heirs to the throne of Achaea walked to their doom. Mother's golden hair took a deep copper color from the blood of the rising sun, so soon to be matched by the blood of human cruelty. I knew mine looked the same for this morning, Mother, and I were identical in all respects save age. It was her intention to reinforce the image of my gender by constant reference to her own. Together we wore widow's black, accented by silver that took on the color of the sun to look like drops of blood already spattered on our bodies. Berith would not stand out in the annals of our realm for the sacrifice of his life. In the oldest records, no distinction was made between this surrender to death and death in battle. In truth, there was no practical difference as the losers were always executed. We had become more civilized since then. Now a dozen peasant families had already been sacrificed to escort my brother to his eternity. Yet another dozen stood by to ensure he held steadfast to his duty. Such civilized escorts were also no longer remarkable. In time, he would be most memorable for the shortness of his reign, over within hours of his accession to the throne. I wondered if I would survive long enough to have a record of my own and what it would say. As the rays of light crept lower into the valley before the castle, the color lightened to a more golden hue. This did not fill the view with warmth, though. It showed a shifting tan carpet, swirling over the ground like fingers of fog, ever moving with no distinct form or structure. This was the way of the High Canyon Horde, never called an army. Their clothes were as uniform as they could make them, disdaining honorable coats of arms for anonymity in battle except for those whose deeds were so great that no artificial identity was required. Their horde as a whole moved in apparent confusion for the same purpose. It was impossible to count them as they constantly shifted elements from one sector of the battlefield to another. There was no doubt about the destination of our men, though. The headsman was prominent, a long crossbow reach from the drawbridge. Berith and his 3 uncles moved steadily forward, neither hesitation nor anxiety in their strides. When they reached the waiting tan-covered men, it appeared that the faceless members of the horde knew something of our royal family, for each was questioned. From our distance it was impossible to tell what the interrogation entailed, but apparently the answers were satisfactory to our invaders. Each Achaean man turned toward the crenellated wall where Mother and I stood, saluting our bright hair one last time before submitting to a professionally quick end. In all too brief sequence, the males of the royal family were dispatched. Those murders were only the most dramatic sign of our surrender. The gates of stalwart guard were to remain open as sign of submission of the people as a whole. A contingent of the horde flowed toward our castle even as the bodies of our men were bundled in cloths and presented to the disarmed retinue that had accompanied them. With regal dignity I strove to match. Mother descended from the wall and entered the throne room, where she took her accustomed place in the queen's high seat. I, of course, could not take the royal throne as was my right. Instead, I stood at her shoulder in the position of a princess, and in the raiment of a princess. And under it all, the maiden's lover. It had not been a comfortable night for me. The tightness of the too narrow waist had prevented easy breathing regardless of my position, and the unaccustomed bulk of the bosom I had so strangely acquired maintained a sensation of discord in any of my normal postures. I didn't want even to think of the unnatural compression in a so intimate place. Still, the artistry of the palace cosmetician overcame such minor obstacles as a sleepless night, and I looked more attractive than I would have believed possible just 24 hours before. The doors to the throne room were thrown open with casual disregard for protocol, I thought. Then it came to me this was not casual at all, it was flamboyantly arrogant. Yet the actions of those intruding in our chamber were not individually flamboyant. Perhaps a dozen members of the horde entered, though even here it was hard to tell as they maintained their habitual swirl. There was an island of stability in their fog. A pair of men clothed in tan approached on a straight, unyielding line. A third man bearing the symbol of their pagan religion followed the steadfast two. A few feet in front of the dais one threw back his obscuring hood. We saw a face too harsh to be merely lean. Not harshness of expression, of which there was none, but harshness of a deeper, permanent sort. When the children of Achaea were learning to laugh, the child this man had been was learning to live without water for days at a time. That dryness still pervaded him, a parched visage with no waste about it, not even the waste of muscle to pad skin stretched too tightly over sharp-edged bones. His voice was much the same, toneless yet sharp, with no inflection. "Madam Seeley, I presume." Mother ignored his comment utterly, gazing at the open doorway as though still waiting for someone to enter. I saw that I had misjudged the man. There was humor in him after all. It was just not reflected in his face unless he chose to use the expression as part of his communication. A tight smile recognizable by the contrast to his previous neutrality accompanied his next comment, "Queen Seeley, then." At this Mother nodded her head with rigid precision. Her glance never left the open doorway beyond our intruder's head, but she acknowledged his unwelcome presence once her own recognition was proper. "I am Cragdle, king of High Canyon, and by grace of the one true God, now ruler of Achaea," he declared, stepping up to confront Mother from a distance too close for proper court protocol. Still his voice was absent, the comments carried seemingly by force of personality rather than the volume others would need. He waved his hand, and the other figure who had strode directly to our dais pulled back his own hood and approached to stand in front of me. This man was inches taller than Cragdle and had the wide shoulders and large hands of my father and older brother. Yet his body reflected a lean economy more reminiscent of Bareth. Of the men in my experience, my father and brothers had been the greatest warriors. This man, though, looked to combine the best of the fighters in my heritage. His face did not show the harshness of the thirst that had marked Cragdle, yet the additional flesh he carried on his face was spare and efficient. More than any other distinction from his father, though, his warm, brown eyes lacked the ruthlessness of the glittering chips of black rock displayed by our conqueror. Instead, the eyes showed interest, all the more terrifying when I realized I was the primary focus of that interest. "Your Majesty," in another voice there would have been a sneer buried in that comment to the Queen, but the flatness of Cragdle's whisper robbed it of clear insult. "Allow me to present my son, Leonidas. He will be regent in Achaea. In accordance with that duty, I have charged him to act as judge in our first case. A case of possible treason." Then he turned that snake's glare on me. What have we here?" "A royal princess, no less," he whispered in that voiceless hiss. We had heard rumors of another child. He started to move toward me, and one of the royal guards moved to interpose himself. An instant of irritation flickered in the black coals of Cragdle's eyes. He looked around the throne room at the surviving leaders of the army of Achaea, and his smile changed to something even uglier. "Leonidas, my son, have you ever noticed how hard it is to tell the difference between the Achaean soldiers and their women?" he mused without inflection. "Why, even this delicate flower might be one of their noble warriors in disguise," he continued, pointing at me. A low, wordless growl escaped from the men of Achaea in the room. There was a shifting that cleared sword arms. Cragdle ignored it completely, but his swirl of men did not. Their own arms moved beneath the concealing cloaks, accompanied by a muted whisper of steel withdrawing from sheaths. Leonidas forestalled the imminent battle by stepping up to me with a grin. He ignored my guard and said to his father, "There is really only one way to be sure." A shake of Mother's head, even more constrained than her previous acknowledgement, caught Leonidas' attention. Cragdle used the opportunity to deliver a threat he had obviously intended from before he entered the throne room. "Why, if we found that this creature were male," this part was said with amusement, but then his tone became vicious, "or if we found another male heir hidden anywhere in the castle." We would be forced to execute every single member of the Achaean royal family to ensure that no other heirs masqueraded among the inhabitants. Since such treachery might permit disguise as serving girls or even children, every person residing in this castle would be sacrificed to the traitor's deception. Again, there was that flicker of amusement on Cragdle's sun-darkened features as he observed the total lack of response from Mother. No fear, no guilt, no anxiety colored her regal features. After it was clear his threat would bring no response, he concluded with yet another question. Is there anything you wish to say before we conduct our trial? Queen Celie finally spoke. This is my daughter, Charisse. I am not responsible for your rumors. You have the power to murder peasants, and for that reason our heirs died in honor. Do not assume that gives you ultimate power over us. We who remain will die before we are dishonored, for death is available to all. If you defile my daughter, we will save you the trouble of executions, and with our dying breath we will curse you before God. Our people will know of your perfidy and of the uselessness of surrender. You will not see any value from your usurpation and butchery, not now, and not for future generations too numerous to count. The smile vanished from Cragdle's face while Mother spoke. At the end of her speech, he put it back on his features with deliberate intent, but he stepped back. The amusement on his face made a claim of being still in control of this audience, but the true battle of wills had been won by Mother, and at least she, Cragdle, and I knew it. Leonidas, how would you determine if this is truly a woman? He offered with that tight little grin. My sex was clear in his mind, but he would use this joke he had made up himself as an excuse to gloat about his power. Leonidas reached out to me with his large, muscular hands. The audience in the chamber gasped, then gasped again as Queen Celie stood. For countless generations, the imperial edict has proscribed the defilement of women, whether maid or matron, she reminded him. There hasn't been an emperor for most of those generations you invoke, Cragdle snarled. Perhaps not, but the other nations of the old empire still obey those precepts of civilization. My brother, King Nikolai of Verdantland, has told me many times of his respect for those ancient traditions. Please subscribe for the next part and visit my Patreon page for early access. Thanks.